I'm sure you've been seeing this, John, as well, which is this awakening that maybe humans haven't been fitting in on the planet.
Yeah.
and and I know that it sounds ridiculous for people who've been following the environmental movement forever, but it does seem to be like in the zeitgeist, this kind of like, huh. And you can't sort of pin it on one thing, but I do think that COVID has crystallized the moment.
Yeah.
And this concept that nature is not just a source of extraction, not a derivative that we can always use, but that we can actually learn from, that aha. And I think that coincides with cultural awakening, this indigenous knowledge reclamation that's finally coming back up, this idea that we're all one, and that that life is an intricate web, and we can learn from life just as much as we can, of course, still utilize it. That's a different, it sounds so simple, but it's a paradigm shift.
I think many people have been feeling elements of the same. I think people have often used paradigm shift loosely. I know you're not doing so, but I mean, I always remember Thomas Kuhn talking about paradigm shifts as things that take about 70 to 80 years to crank through, because you need to lose a generation infected with the previous paradigm, and then the people they taught, other people have said similar things, but we're about sort of 65, 70 years into one of those shifts. And I think the next 10, 15 years are going to see exponential acceleration. And I just think it's fascinating when you talk about learning from nature, and the whole principle of Biomimicry 3.8 is that life has been learning tough lessons, extended lessons for 3.8 billion years. And here we go again. Now, the question is whether we're up to learning the appropriate lessons in the relevant timescales.
The new book is about nature's universal patterns. What are these universals that we should all know, especially if you're going to be a maker, right? There's a disproportionate impact, whether designers and engineers know this or not. I think designers do, because they usually have a healthy degree of ego that goes along with something as brave as putting a new product into the world. But they hold a disproportionate impact over our world, and they should know these universal patterns. They should understand branching patterns intimately. They should know how nature heals, how nature makes composites. These are fundamentals, whether you're making a widget or you're designing a new city. And so that's what the new book is about. And we're incredibly excited to see that. It's a couple of years out still by the time a book is, hits the shelves, but she's close. There is a new degree of empathy that has come up in the world. And I think that empathy, and it's funny because whether you point to, one of my god kids who's a vegan, and she does it for, just to be empathetic toward all life on the planet, or you look at sort of like new degrees of climate impact that are happening and people are starting to make that connection. There's enough vectors right now that are all converging around this question of empathy. And I think that that's what really it's guided me. I would have called it justice, because I was a lawyer before this. And then I went from being a lawyer to working in politics. And then I worked.
We forgive you.
I know, I'm responsible for this. And then after politics, I worked in tech and worked here in Silicon Valley. And then that was when Janine's book and Cradle to Cradle both got sort of plopped on my desk by colleagues. And I went, oh, we can have both. So there we are working and trying to bring technology to India and Brazil and South Africa. And in the back of your head, you're like, how has this worked out for Western countries, right? In the end, we have a mountain of e-waste. We have mountains of disenfranchised people. So you're thinking this, but of course, who are you to make that decision on someone else's behalf? So if we could design it, if there truly is, as McDonough says, this is a design problem, then biomimicry was the piece that held the answer. So it was easy to kind of like, the narrative arc of my life has been one toward justice and empathy. And so it was an easy transition to make, to say that, well, this is what I want to work on. And so when I was at Cradle to Cradle, which happened after the tech part, I'm very old, John. I have had many careers.
It's just very quickly. I mean, it's interesting. You talk about the arc of justice, and that's sort of Martin Luther King to some degree. And we look at what's happened with Black Lives Matter and the shootings just recently, and so on. These things take an incredibly long time to move towards that endpoint. And what keeps you going, given that the evidence very often is, as in these piles, mountains of e-waste and all the rest of it, signaling that things aren't necessarily totally going in our direction?
That's a great question. What keeps me going is the constant stream of new students, new entrepreneurs, or crusty old people from corporations who have like had an awakening moment.
Yeah.
And they say, I want to do this differently in my time. I want my life to stand for this instead of that. And they recognize that there's, I mean, we talk about this is a little bit reductionist, but one of the advantages to thinking like a biomimic is quite frankly just more effective, maybe even efficient too. So technology readiness level that NASA uses, that companies use from 0 to 9 or 10 as launch, most ideas you start at a 0. But if you use biomimicry, if you're actually starting with a design that already works in nature, you know that bumps will be hydrophobic, you know that ridges will actually, move our branching pattern like we talked about before, you're starting at a 3, maybe even a 4, depending upon where you are. Yes, you have all this other hard work then in terms of translating it into the context that you need, the materials that you have available, you have to commercialize it. Those are not insignificant things. But if you can actually start at a 3 instead of a 0, that is what this time requires. That is what like most human impatience requires. And so I think that from a selfish perspective alone, we should be looking to nature, not to mention every other reason.
Do you think there's a danger with sort of nature's wisdom just being, well, I mentioned Boeing. I remember the idea that, for example, you could use shark skin equivalent materials and put them around the fuselage of aircraft, and that would sort of somehow promote their fuel efficiency. What if companies started to lock up legally property which by right should be, you would have thought, common to humanity?
You are so prescient. I don't know how you do it, but this was literally the question on the lips of the board and myself just yesterday. So this is a long-standing question. The short answer is you cannot. There was a case in 2013 by the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it was U.S. versus Myriad, M-Y-R-I-A-D, where Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas of all people, actually said that you can't patent nature. You can't patent. In this case, it was a genome, and you can patent the emulation and what you've created based upon how, in this case, that genome worked. But you can't patent the thing itself. And that's not to say that Monsanto, now Bayer, hasn't tried. They will try, and they will continue to try. But one of the things that we're really keen to do is put as much of the biology into the public domain as possible to prevent that very thing. So IP rights, and it's funny because most venture capitalists that I speak to, and indeed when we did a pilot project with IBM, the first thing, like once they really get this, John, they're like, this is an IP generator, what you're talking about. You can actually really decode nature. If you can understand its blueprints and you have that technology readiness advantage that we just discussed, this is a massive IP generator. And our goal, not only as a nonprofit, but again, in that arc toward justice, is that it be truly accessible to all. And so we are on a race to just put as much of this material onto Ask Nature into the public domain as possible, but also just to make sure that that lawyers and policymakers do their job. What's going to be interesting, you can see where a thin film coating on a chair is really different than what you would put onto the body of an airplane from a material standpoint. But what is not clear yet is the algorithmic or geometric emulation that it becomes a CAD file. Who should own that? And that's where it's super gray. And that's where I'd like us to not just put the literature up and a distillation of that so that anyone can understand it, but an actual formula. And this is where I think Linux is a great model. Open source is a really great model.
And over time, as more and more people scramble to be part of all of this, two things. One is you need more funding. So and I know you've got some significant additional funding recently, but where's that going to come from over time, do you think? And as more and more people recognize what's the market potential of what biomimicry offers, there's going to be this mad scramble, this sort of gold rush of people wanting to be part of all of this, and probably we'll see greenwashing and you know, sort of almost going into sort of overdrive. So funding and competition for attention, I mean, how do you see those playing out, or what sort of strategy do you foresee adopting?
Is this where we put my email up in like neon flashing letters? Call Beth. I think the people who fall in love with biomimicry and indeed fund us to large degree are people who understand design thinking, people who understand this twofold. One, the design thinking, and the second part are the people who intrinsically understand that nature holds answers that humans haven't quite cracked yet, and want to see that democratized, for lack of a better phrase. The competition question is a really interesting one. When Janine speaks, when I speak, when others on our team speak, John, I swear we get two questions. It's always the same two questions. I'm an investor. I think what you've just described is phenomenal. How do I get involved? The second one is I'm a parent. I think what you're describing is an edge, and I want my kid to have that edge. So that's the other. So the people who fund us are usually interested in one of those two camps, usually as well.
So how is the biomimicry crew engaging younger people in schools and so on, and probably the wider educational process, not just younger folk?
The short answer is we have a youth design challenge, and it's hitting, we're only going on our third year here, and we were going to pilot it with a small, like, you know, we wanted 100 teachers and we got 600 teachers. Then the next year we wanted a small magical pilot of 1,000 and we got 10,000. So like, it's just, the demand is so great. And I want to talk about that in a second, because what these 12-year-old, 15-year-olds are producing is one of our friends says, like, they're punching above their weight. There's no way that they understand the physics, the chemistry that's involved in some of the solutions that they're putting forth, but they understand the biology. And that's enough to get this group of 12-year-old boys to create these basically a hexagonal shaped roof tile that mimics the Saharan silver ant, which has inherently like a triangular design. So it bounces light, and then there's a sort of an insulative layer as well. And they just realized, well, with climate change, hot places are only going to get hotter. We can't keep running our air conditioners. We actually have to do, well, what does the Saharan silver ant do who can survive 120 degrees? It has this and it's not just the silvery color. That silvery color comes from this sort of reflective property. They were able to look at that, look at the scorpion, look at the honeycomb, and say, well, why are roof tiles made of tar and asphalt, which are only conducting heat? I mean, a 12-year-old boy is getting this faster than any of these books. But the other parts, I don't know that puberty or anything else is going to. I think there are these jumps in consciousness that happen. And I think that Rachel Carson was a jump, and that awareness, oh, wait a minute, maybe we're the reason that the songbirds have stopped singing. And then you have this kind of awareness around regulation. Before 1963, so before Rachel Carson, there were maybe 5 major environmental laws in the United States, and one of them was the establishment of the national parks. After 1963, 50, 60 major pieces of legislation, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, etc. These are step changes. And then you have the circular economy. So this idea of like, so you go from like education to regulation to monetization. Like you have this third wave of like, wait a minute, Ellen says we're leaving $1 trillion on the table simply from just being inefficient. You can't unsee these things after they've happened. And I think that the new fourth wave here is this idea of reconnection, regeneration. I think these are new levels that collectively we move toward.
So talk a little bit about regeneration, because in a way the concept has been around for a very long time. I mean, fallowing in agriculture or urban regeneration or whatever, but it seems to be spiking fairly intensely at the moment. Paul Hawken has his new book coming out in the fall. Where do you think that's coming from? Do you think it's helpful or not? Where are we going? Some simple questions.
Where are we going? One of the one of our, and maybe a contemporary of yours, Natasha Garaudy, a really talented filmmaker who was on our board.
Yeah.
And she was to say the era of design for design's sake is over. We have to design for other reasons, for other motivations now. That is a powerful concept. And I think that that's where we are with biomimicry. That's another reason why we're seeing such interest. It's not enough to just put forth a new kind of concrete. Yes, it should, like the new kinds of concrete will sequester carbon.
Yeah.
100%, that's what everything has to do. But one of our teams that came out of the Racing Anderson Ray of Hope Prize was e-concrete. And they said, in addition, we're adding basically triggers into the concrete so that biological life will attach to it. Calcification will happen to it. This concrete will get stronger over time. It will emulate a coral reef. Living organisms will thrive in it. We will put a roughness to the, as opposed to 50% of coastlines is where most people live.
Yeah.
Marine degradation is happening at a rate, and we keep putting this cement, like these straight cement walls, right, to hold up piers and etc. Life can't cling to that, and eventually it degrades. This is exactly the opposite. This is actually making something that's not just stronger, but also performs ecosystem services at the same time. So regeneration has to happen. It's a requirement for any of the teams who come through our challenge, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for the longest time, people thought, well, that's just too hard or it's not possible. And now we're proving year over year that it is both feasible and actually feels good.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because with rising sea levels and the need for barrages and barriers and levees and all the rest of it, having materials that can be colonized and turned into part of the natural world really, really important. And I think in a way, I think a lot of people who would build buildings of concrete, the last thing they would want would be colonization by nature of the materials that they're putting into skyscrapers. But isn't it interesting at the moment? You have people starting to think about how you bring nature back into cities, how you green skyscrapers, partly building them out of timber, but also sort of having the vegetation on the outside. How much interest are you seeing in the biomimicry comes to town, comes to the city sort of agenda from architects, planners, people like that, mayors?
Well, we see a lot, and actually, if you have a conversation with Janine and Biomimicry 3.8, they can speak extensively about that. What we're seeing is more at the emerging markets, developing countries perspective. I mean, you have to remember that 4.2 billion people don't have access to clean sanitation on a daily basis. And at the same time, we know that we're going to be facing a global water shortage. And so do you start to bring in massive sewer systems where you move waste with potable water? Or do you actually think of a new way to process waste? And it turns out that, like 95% of our peeing poop is water. And so there's a company called Change Water Labs, phenomenal female CEO, Diana Youssef, worked on the International Space Station, took some of those concepts, because that's a very contained, necessarily sustainable environment, brought it to how do we rethink porta potties, basically. And so she uses these bags, and it's evapotranspiration, which is exactly how a plant pulls water and releases it through the stomata of its leaves, right?
Yeah.
And so you actually have this dehydration process of sewage. Now, all of a sudden, you don't need to trench for new water supplies. You can have, and you also have a nutrient that you can actually use eventually, with UV treatment, which is just leaving it in the sun for a certain amount of time. You can treat actual crops, but you can certainly immediately put it into your forests for nutrient reclamation.
And the price point, is that going to be affordable? Nature's done this for 3.8 billion years, so it's taken all the risk and absorbed all the costs.
Right.
This new stuff, is this going to be sort of affordable and accessible for exactly the people that you're talking about?
100%. They're actually piloting right now across Uganda, and again, we've so narrowly, you know this better than anybody else. You piloted these, we have so narrowly defined price point, and that as soon as, when I flushed my toilet, do I account for the infrastructure that Marin Water District had to put into place? And do I account for the incidental pharmaceuticals or pesticides that are going into that water and where that water treatment is? None of that is factored into total cost of ownership for the individual. So I think that redefinition of value has to be part of the equation. But regardless, she's still finding a way to make it incredibly price competitive. Yeah. And it's a social service on top of it all.
What frustrates you about this whole area of biomimicry? What's holding all of this stuff back? What can we do about that? Great
question, John. There's two things. One is, even though it's our ardent mission to bring biology to designers and engineers, it is still really hard to do. A lot is locked up behind paywalls. We're still navigating that. And making it, then once you get it from behind the paywall, making it really understandable and accessible, so that, again, the person who stopped taking it back in freshman year still really not just gets it, but wants to do something with it. Second problem is materials. We are still so nascent in understanding. Most of what we've done for the last 50+ years has been like revising petroleum. And now we're at this place of thinking, okay, are we going to now enslave enzymes and bacteria to do the same, which would be infinitely brighter, of course, but we still have such a basic understanding of how the core building blocks of what nature uses would be the proteins, the chitins, the cellulose, etc. Mm-hmm. And then again, the enzymes and the bacteria. I think that material science is the next horizon. And what I see for the future of Biomimicry Institute specifically is emerging with green chemistry. I don't think that there should just be green chemistry over here and biology, biomimicry over here. This has to be done in concert. I think that what we're seeing right now is the development of new consortia. In one of these pilots, we will be partnering with Yale Green Chemistry, Paul Anastas, to be part of this, so that the goal of the pilots is to show decomposition, which has been missing so much from. We think about fashion, we think about making anything, we think about where you're going to source it from, what are you going to make? So primary production and then the consumption. Circular economy has said, well, let's see what parts we can recycle back. The problem is that, less than 10% of anything is getting recycled. So where's the 90% going? It's incinerated, it's landfill, it's fragments and particles. We have not thought through decomposition as a species, certainly not as designers and engineers. That's the gist of what this next pilot will be about. So it has to be done with green chemists. It has to be part of the equation. We will be bringing engineers and biologists and designers and chemists to the table all together to work on this.
Well, I think it would be absolutely facile, but I'm going to do it anyway, to say that sort of economics was the language of business and markets in the last century. And biomimicry is well placed to become the equivalent, but actually a rather saner and wiser approach to making decisions and choices. So, I remain absolutely fascinated by what you severally are doing. Huge thanks for what you do. Huge thanks for what you will do next. And many, many thanks for just taking the time today to talk through some of the stuff.
John, it's a real pleasure always to speak with you. Thank you for inviting me.